To all those who are watching, welcome. Our session today will be on mapping historic sites in rural Manitoba, development themes and applications. And our presenter today is Dr. Gordon Goldsboro. Dr. Gordon is married and a father of 2 young adults. He is a professor of biological sciences at the University of Manitoba. His research work is in wetlands and water quality. Dr. Gordon is also an active member of the Manitoba Historical Society, being head researcher, webmaster, vice president, and an editor and production coordinator of Manitoba History magazine. Dr. Gordon is also a member of the City of Winnipeg Historical Buildings and Resources Committee. He has written 4 books on Manitoba history and has mapped thousands of historic sites around the province. He is presently doing a weekly series on CBC Radio 1 entitled Abandoned Manitoba. Dr. Gordon has released his new book, More Abandoned Manitoba, Rivers, Rails, and Ruins. The work framework, the thousands of historically important sites that spot the province's landscapes. I am now going to pass it on to our presenter, Dr. Gordon.
Okay, greetings everyone. As was introduced, my name is Gordon Goldsboro. I'm a professor at the University of Manitoba. But what I want to describe with you this afternoon is a project I've been doing with the Manitoba Historical Society for about 10 years. I have been traveling around Manitoba, mapping historic places of all sorts. And in fact, this work has led to 2 books now, the first of which came out 2 years ago, entitled Abandoned Manitoba. The idea being these were sites around Manitoba that were abandoned but which had an interesting backstory to tell. The book has been quite successful, and on the grounds of that, I was asked to write a sequel. The sequel came out 2 weeks ago. It's entitled More Abandoned Manitoba, and I take another 28 places and talk about the sorts of stories that they have to tell. So when I was invited to give this webinar, I thought, well, what should I tell you about in the course of this next few minutes? Well, the outline of what I'd like to talk about is essentially, first of all, what is the project that the Manitoba Historical Society is doing? How did it get started? How has it developed? And what is its present status? I would like to talk a little bit towards the end of the presentation on various uses that we have had for this project, and especially in the context of the group of people who are listening this, today, how it might be particularly useful in a rural planning and development context. And then I'll conclude with just a few remarks about our future plans on where this project is going to go. So starting back about 10 years ago, I had an opportunity to travel in southwestern Manitoba, and I found this building. It was, in fact, a bank vault in the 1880s. It was developed at a time when the railway had not yet reached this part of Manitoba. When the railway did arrive a few years later, it bypassed the town, and therefore the town essentially moved to where the railway is located today. But the bank vault, being sufficiently large, couldn't be moved, was left behind. And I had been told that this bank vault was still present, and it took me hours to find it. And I remember thinking at the time that there's got to be a better approach, especially now that we live in a very technological age where GPS is ubiquitous. Many of us, of course, carry cell phones that have GPS capability. Why wouldn't it be possible to have navigation basically at your fingertips, that you could say, I want to go to this bank vault, and it would navigate you to it? Well, that was the beginning of the project, and up till the last few days, we have been mapping approximately 7,000 sites. So you can pick pretty much any part of the province, and you can find historic places in that part of the province. There are buildings, cemeteries, monuments, museums, and archives. And then there's a host of other sites that are simply, well, we have an other category that has a lot of different things in it. We've also got a lot of places for which there are no remaining signs. The buildings, the cemeteries, whatever they were there are gone. All we know is that someone with authority has been able to tell us that's where it was, and that's in the system. So the symbols that are shown here correspond to the maps that I'm going to be showing periodically. The various types of symbols denote the various types of historic sites that we have mapped. As you can see from this pie chart, the vast majority of the sites are in rural Manitoba. Over 80% of them are outside of the capital city, Winnipeg. Now, this will give you sort of an initial look at the map. On the left-hand side is the the map you see on a desktop computer, on the right what you see on a mobile phone application, and we do want to make this experience seamless, that you can use any sort of device. You can query it because there is a database, and I'll talk about that a little later, that you can find specific sites that match certain criteria. In other words, it doesn't show you everything, it shows you what you have asked to see. So I guess the first question to address is, how do we include the things that we have included in this inventory? So in other words, what makes a site historic? Well, we include objects, either natural objects or constructed objects that have some sort of significance. Maybe it's because they have a particularly unique material or an unusual construction technique, a certain style that is rare. And they usually have some sort of public function. We typically try to avoid private buildings, simply because it then opens the field to a substantially larger number of them. Or it might be a site where there was some noteworthy event occurred in the past, or that there was some connection to a noteworthy person. But it begs the question, what constitutes noteworthy? In other words, who decides that it's a person, a place, or a thing that warrants identification? And that's something I'll come back to a little bit later, because I have some thoughts about that matter. One of the questions that I'm often asked is, well, how do we find these places? Because a lot of them are quite obscure. They're difficult places to reach. Well, there's a variety of ways that we find them. Certainly searching local history books has been one technique. Local knowledge, and in fact, increasingly, social media is a wonderful means to identify these sites, mainly because we want to ensure that people feel open to contributing, that they will contribute sites that maybe they are the only ones that know about them. Random traveling is not very practical, simply because of the size of Manitoba. It's also not very efficient. There's only a few cases where it has happened, but I'll show you a couple of examples where that has come about. And then last of all, I find that using Google Earth is one of my go-to tools. So let me give you just one example. Here's an image from southwestern Manitoba, not far from Brandon. It is a river called the Little Saskatchewan. And in the imagery from Google Earth, you can see that there is very definitely something there crossing the river, something that perhaps looks not natural. So I would put it in my to-do list. When I would go to that site in the future, I would then investigate what might it be. And it turns out when I was there, it turns out that it is a bridge. In fact, a fairly old bridge by Manitoba standards, built exactly 100 years ago. It has been abandoned now for probably several decades. In fact, it was, in fact, one time a major bridge for a highway between two of our cities here in Manitoba, Minnedosa and Rapid City. It has been abandoned simply because the road was redirected. One of my personal interests are one-room schools, mainly because of what they imply for the evolution of education here in Manitoba. You know, at one time, many people would have attended a school like this one. In fact, in this one room, there would have been potentially 20, 30, sometimes 40 students, one teacher, maybe 8 or 10 grades. You know, the conditions of education were fairly primitive, and of course, as compared to what we have today. So traveling around the province, I would encounter buildings like this one. In this particular case, someone had very generously left a ladder behind, so it permitted me to climb the ladder, climb inside, and take pictures like this one. So I believe, for example, strongly in documenting all of these buildings because they do disappear. And having a good photographic record provides a long-term record of what these things looked like. So in this case, of course, you can see it was at one time a school. The blackboards, for example, are still attached. So looking around Manitoba, this is another portion of our map that shows the locations of the one-room schoolhouses. And again, those symbols denote the various kinds of things they are. Blue meaning monuments of some kind. Green, simply the location of a school, though there's nothing present at the site anymore. Red, the actual buildings themselves, many of which have turned into other things. They've been renovated into people's homes, into granaries. Sometimes they're standing abandoned, as that previous example showed. We are, however, linking these sites in many cases to our online inventory. So, for example, I was involved with a project a few years ago with the rural municipality of McDonald. And there we put up signs around the municipality denoting the locations of one-room schools. The sign itself was fairly modest, as you can see here. The sign shape was a little unusual simply because it was the shape of a sign. If you looked at a map showing the locations of schools, at one time this is the symbol they would have used. On the sign was also a QR code that you can scan with a smartphone, and it'll take you to our webpage where there are, among other things, photos of the school, lists of the teachers at the school, and the various other details as to when it operated, when it closed, and what happened to it afterwards. So we envision over the future that this will be something we'll do more and more frequently. Now, I won't dwell on this, and it will be a presentation all of its own, but in traveling around and doing a lot of this work, I have inevitably put together a list of what I would call the explorer's toolkit. You know, the sorts of things that you would want to take along in collecting this sort of information. And some of it is, you know, practical, you know, how do you find it? So you need various maps, GPS, you need cameras, you know, spare parts, for instance. I personally strongly believe in taking along business cards because it helps to establish credibility of the person who is out investigating these things. And then there's a whole bunch of other details. For instance, when I'm traveling in rural Manitoba, I'm frequently far from the nearest station for gas, so I routinely carry a gas can with me. I often take talking books so that I can keep myself amused when I'm out traveling in places where there is no radio reception. So it's sort of the things that I've learned simply from experience, having traveled a lot. These are the sorts of things that I would routinely take along. Another thing, of course, is that many times the buildings that I encounter, for instance, are degraded. In fact, often significantly so. So here, for instance, is a site out in western Manitoba. It's called the Scallion Farm. It was the home of a very prominent member of the community who was active in local politics. In fact, he was active in engaging farmers in the political process through what was initially called the United Farmers of Manitoba. And then inevitably it became the governing party in Manitoba. In fact, Manitoba's longest governing premier was, in fact, a leader of this particular party. This house, of course, as you can see, not in good condition. And I, in fact, personally wouldn't venture inside. It's simply too dangerous. But that's always a consideration because these buildings are old and, in fact, oftentimes are structurally quite dubious. So, in fact, I often look for signs of compromise, and if they are, I just don't venture inside. But I would encourage, if you are ever not sure about whether you should go in, my mantra is that if you're in doubt, stay out, because it simply isn't worth the injuries or worse that could occur if you were in a building that fell away when you were inside. One of the aspects that I've been quite actively involved in as well is to take imagery of these sites from an unusual perspective. So I have, for example, been using a drone for a number of years as a way of getting sites from an unusual perspective. Let me give you an example. There's a site in western Manitoba near the city of Dauphin that was the site of a Second World War training facility of the Commonwealth Air Training Plan. At this site, air crews for the Second World War would have been trained, pilots, navigators, bombardiers, and others. And from the ground, there's not a lot you see other than just miscellaneous concrete bits. From the air with the drone, what you can see fairly evidently is the outlines of the buildings. Here we see, for instance, the large hangars that would have housed the aircraft as that part of that facility. Roads are visible, a host of other sites as well. So I'm a big advocate for using drones in this sort of application. There are, however, downsides, and I emphasize that one of my concerns, for example, is that there are bird challenges. Drones are a very frequent target for birds if they're in the vicinity, and that can damage the drones, could cause them to crash. I've had problems also with various other angry problems with bugs and dogs and cattle and people, barbed wire, electric fence, vegetation, and hordes of mud. You know, a lot of the roads are very definitely not travelable, and so it has been a bit of a challenge a lot of times. Permission and privacy has also been an issue, as have sensitive areas, and I'll talk a little bit about that briefly. So, of course, in this day and age, we are often concerned about privacy, and I have been quite mindful of this, particularly when it involves making challenges for how do you find the information that you want. There basically are a few online sources that you can help you find, for example, who owns these sites in order to gain permission to investigate them. But a lot of times it comes down to basically old school detective methods. I'll give you one example just to illustrate. One of the things I often hear is, well, why didn't you phone me? Why didn't you email me? Why didn't you send me a letter to come and see? Well, the reality is it's often difficult to find out who it is who owns a site, to make those sort of phone calls, emails, or letters. And sometimes it's simply better just to adopt the strategy, as I often do. It's easier to simply ask for forgiveness after going to look at a site than it is to ask for permission. But in this case, the one I'm showing you here now is a grain elevator that was once a commercial entity. It's now owned by a private farmer. I went to the municipal office asking who that farmer was. They refused to answer. They told me that it was private information I wasn't unable to know. Well, fortunately, in the municipal office, there was a map of land ownership. On this map, there was a little marker showing the location of that elevator. It said it was a small parcel A1. Next to the map, there was a little legend that said that site was owned by something called the Eli Elevator, Inc. So in other words, even though they wouldn't tell me the information, the map right behind them revealed the information that allowed me to go then to the corporate office in the provincial government and seek the records on this company. And sure enough, there it was. It gave me the names of all of the principals of the company. I was able to make contact with them, and I was able to secure permission. It's the sort of detective work I would not normally undertake. It's simply too onerous in most cases. But it is worthwhile whenever possible to make that effort. Here's another example where privacy was an issue. We have a nice old stone house in rural Manitoba made of field stones in a fairly elaborate construction technique. Standing now over 100 years. It has actually been vacant for quite a long part of that time. I visited it 2 years ago with the permission of the owner. We had explicit permission. I then talked about it on a radio program and showed it on the internet, and I got a very angry response from the owner fairly shortly thereafter, where he was very upset that I had posted this information online. The reason for his anger was, in fact, that people often do not act respectfully when they come to see it. So, for example, he sent me this photograph of someone who had driven through his grain crop to visit the site, and with complete disregard for his crop. And as you can see in this photo, they trampled it. They left behind trash that he had to clean up. And ultimately, he was worried that if any time someone hurt themselves on the site, he would be held liable. So last spring, he sent me another photo of the building. This is, in fact, that building. He burned it, and then he bulldozed it, so there's nothing left. And unfortunately, of course, it means we've lost some of our heritage, but I have at least documented, and now he's quite happy with me putting it in information online. So there's a case where people being disrespectful kind of spoiled it for everybody. Another example is this one. It's an indigenous burial mound in southwestern Manitoba. It has been designated nationally as a National Historic Site, but because they worry about grave robbing and the potential for looking for indigenous artifacts, they've asked that its location not be revealed. It's a fairly innocuous looking site. They simply don't want anyone to know where it's located. So I'm mindful of those sorts of issues as well. But anyway, in terms of the actual backup, the sort of mechanics of this system, we have initially a spreadsheet where the information is maintained. It's simply an Excel spreadsheet. We collect the information and put it into a form that is then transferable into a database. So in the spreadsheet, we have things like the name of the site, we have the municipality in which it's located, we have keywords, or what we might call metadata, we have the location, the precise latitude and longitude that is necessary for the mapping engine. That all goes into a SQL database that's running on a Linux server that can then respond to queries where you can search for things like the names of the sites. You can look for fractions of the names, in other words, subsets of the name. You can search particular municipalities, certain addresses. You can search by the metadata. So for instance, we have been putting in alternative spellings so that no matter how you spell a commonly misspelled word, you'll still find it. We put in building materials, the names of architects, special projects like that QR code project that I showed you earlier, the ethnicity of the people that may be connected to a particular site, a whole host of these things that, well, we're gradually over time adding more of these sort of descriptors to help enhance the ability to search the database. Let me give you one example. So here's the fairly primitive search capability. We are presently coming up with a new interface that will hopefully be engaged fairly soon. And the idea will be a little more user-friendly. This one, it simply gives you 3 keyword fields, a municipality field, the type of site that it is, and then you can designate if you want to see sites that have formal designation, either locally, whether provincially or nationally, you can choose. So let's say, for example, I'm interested in grain elevators. So I will search on the phrase grain elevator, and I put in a keyword that is actually a little secret one that I use internally called no photo, which basically means that I do not have a photograph of it, which might then be a clue for somebody that maybe has photos to share them. So I'll search the database for it. It will tell me that there's a number of matches, and then I can put them on a customized Google map. So here we see that map. The location symbols are where the elevators were at the time. Of course, many fewer grain elevators than in the past. Many of them have been torn down, burned, or moved. In this particular case, what I've done is I've clicked on one of those symbols, and a little bubble has popped up telling me the type of elevator that was and where it was located. That's a hyperlink, which you can then click on. It will take you then to a map where it gives you, among other things, details about that grain elevator, such as its precise location. It gives you, for example, the latitude and longitude. It gives you a little map. It might give you additional information, but in this case, because there were no photos, there would not be a photo of the elevator, and hopefully in time somebody would want to do that, to provide one. So how can we use this resource? And I see it as a resource in a number of areas. Because, of course, there are themes that are engaged in these sites that we have mapped. Of course, one of them inevitably is rural depopulation. Like so many other parts of Canada and the United States and elsewhere, large areas of rural Manitoba are depopulating. The small towns are disappearing, larger centers are growing, and that's something that you can explore by searching areas of Manitoba. Agricultural mechanization, of course, the change in the nature of agriculture has led to things like the reduction in the number of grain elevators. The development of telecommunications. We have mapped, for example, repeater stations that were used when telephony was done through a series of repeaters, where every few miles there would have had to amplify the signal. Construction techniques, one of the metadata tags we're adding is the nature of the construction materials that are found in buildings, for instance. So if you wanted to see buildings that are made of wood, buildings that are made out of bricks, buildings made out of concrete blocks, you can search that way. The evolution of education, of course, the transition from the one-room school to the large multi-classroom schools with gymnasia, computer labs, libraries, and so on. Changing attitudes to organized religion. So many small churches all over rural Manitoba are standing empty, and you can map that. You can see patterns of ethnicity. You can search, for example, by particular denominations of religion. You can look for particular ethnicities related to those different churches. And then, as I mentioned with that case of that training facility, the wartime training facility, you can look at the home front involvement in wartime. So there's all kinds of themes that come out of drilling down into this database. So what are some of the uses? Well, I'm sure there's many, and I don't know that I would come up with all of them, but I'll just give you a few that I certainly see. One is through education, and I don't mean this simply through the schools. Anybody, and we find, for example, that people use this website for a variety of purposes relating to historical research, genealogical research. Frankly, I've had people contact me who are scouting for movie locations. They're trying to find a particular building that fulfills their need for a certain kind of thing, and this gives them the means to do that easily and efficiently. I've often been in contact with funeral homes looking for a cemetery where they've been asked to bury someone. Teachers, of course, can lead their students on tours of faraway communities, maybe because they don't have the ability to go to those communities, they don't have the means. Sometimes it's because they simply want to explore a comparison with their own community. I also encourage students to engage in the process of collecting the data, to find sites that warrant inclusion in this inventory, because not only does that give them some valuable research experience, I think it also provides intergenerational communication. They talk, for example, to their parents, their grandparents, other members of their community, and I think that's never a bad thing. So there's certainly things like mapping the locations of war memorials and the names on those war memorials. That's something that students routinely are asked to do. We've been mapping the locations of those war memorials. They can then be supplemented. The web pages for those memorials can be supplemented with the information on the people that are listed on them. Heritage tourism, of course, is another obvious application. Sites that are in the inventory typically get a lot more exposure than they would ever get simply by being found accidentally. And of course, some that are found in fairly obscure locations might never be found otherwise. We've made it far easier for that to occur. Visitors can plan a trip in advance. They can map out a particular route by which they can see certain things that they may have special significance to. Relatives may have attended certain schools, for example. They may have had family members that maybe were killed in wartime and are listed on certain monuments they want to see. In the future, I also envision that this could be used by, among other things, GPS-enabled vehicles, or in the future, if we go completely driverless, I can envision a day when you could actually have historical tours where, as you are driving along or as you are being driven by your driverless car, you could actually be told along the way the various things that you pass. And then if you want to stop and investigate, of course, you'll have the means to do that. Or if you wish to know more information, in real time, you'll be able to get information from this database. From the standpoint of advocacy and public designation, it seems to me that this gives a much stronger role to the community to identify things that are of importance to them, to identify sites that maybe never got official recognition, that maybe deserve some sort of repair or protection, and simply through the identification of significance in this project, it brings it to the attention of some government. Hopefully that will lead then to some formal recognition. I'm hoping that, for example, people who simply have been trying, often without success, to bring attention to some historic sites can do so by way of this inventory. So ultimately, it seems to me that this leads to a democratization process, that it means that people are empowered to identify sites of importance in their community, bring them to a much wider audience, hopefully to engage people in investigating these things, hopefully engage them in the process of researching, and so that they feel that they have learned something valuable. We can correct mistakes, of course, because inevitably when anything is like this is crowdsourced, mistakes occasionally happen, but because it's easily corrected, it's not like publishing a book where mistakes are difficult to correct. Online sources particularly are relatively easy. We do, however, have a protocol that ensures that there is a consistent presentation. We do have a process that tries to identify at least easily identifiable errors, so we can at least try as much as we can to avoid errors. So let me give you one example of the sort of democratization at work. So it was identified to us that one of the older grain elevators in Manitoba was located in southwestern Manitoba at a small community called Elva. This is what that grain elevator looks like. Through the research that I've done, it's turned out that that elevator was constructed in September of 1897. That, we believe, makes it the oldest grain elevator in Manitoba, but we also believe it's probably the oldest grain elevator in Canada. And that, I think, is significant. A number of people who are interested in grain elevators particularly note the unique architecture of this particular one. It's obviously not in use anymore. It's possible that it may suffer destruction. In fact, because the older one, a couple of years older than this one, was going to be designated a few years ago as a National Historic Site because it was the oldest in Canada. I would argue then that this one perhaps could deserve recognition, but hasn't, and may be at risk. Well, in fact, we are then trying to engage people in at least being aware of these various diminishing resources. We have, for example, as part of this map, what we call the grain elevator countdown. So here we have the map showing the various grain elevators that are still standing. There are presently 131 of them. We just lost one about 3 weeks ago. And in fact, only about half of them are in active use for some purpose, usually by a farmer for his own uses. The rest of them are either abandoned or we simply cannot tell. So possibly then there would be interest in at least trying to commemorate some of these in some meaningful way so that people are informed about how agriculture has transformed where these elevators are no longer useful. Now, one of the things we've encountered in Manitoba, if you look at the provincial designation process, the number of sites designated provincially in Manitoba peaked in the 1990s. It increased in the 1980s when there was a in change in legislation that encouraged designation of historic sites. That designation process peaked in the 1990s. It diminished considerably in the 2000s, and now in the current decade, it is essentially zero, almost. And the reality is the provincial government has shown rather complete disinterest in the designation process, has instead referred people to the local governments to encourage the municipalities to designate many of these sites. The worry, it seems to me, is that the same trend holds true at the municipal level. If you look at the trend for rurally municipally designated sites, the same trend holds true. The 90s and a little bit in the 2000s, but in the last decade, the number has diminished considerably. So it seems to me that there is a deficiency in government interest in designating sites of historic significance. And so therefore, it seems to me that it puts the role of advocacy and protection in the hands of the community. So again, this inventory, it seems to me, serves a purpose in helping to promote that rural advocacy. So from the standpoint of planning, and I think this is perhaps where the use or the potential application of this inventory may be the strongest, it seems to me that simply having an inventory provides a useful resource. You know, you cannot count it and find out how many there are. You cannot manage it and find out what degree of protection places have. You cannot draw attention to it and promote awareness of it unless you know about it. This sounds like an obvious statement to make, but of course, a lot of times, especially in rural Manitoba, the resources required to document sites fully is often considerable. And so by crowdsourcing, it seems to me, we achieve the kind of critical mass that governments often lack. You know, the provincial government, for example, simply doesn't have the resources it would require to create an inventory like the one we are creating. It also, of course, is necessary, it seems to me, to establish the backstory as a basis for management and promotion. You know, who created the site in the first place? What was the thing they created? When did they create it? Where exactly is it located? And why, for example, is it no longer in use? If it's abandoned, what led to that abandonment? And there's useful information in answering questions like that. And again, these sort of things can and I think should be crowdsourced to the degree possible. So inventory, I think, one aspect of rural heritage planning. Another is, I think, in management, the next sort of step on management and preservation or conservation. It means that municipalities especially, and I think this is particularly relevant here in Manitoba, we have a lot of municipalities that simply lack the kind of critical mass that it needs to recognize important historical resources, to lacks the ability to do the research that is necessary to answer the questions of who, what, why, when, and so on. And you therefore, because of putting this in online, you engage a potentially much larger talent pool than you would ever be able to engage locally. You know, and so again, to my mind, this means you therefore exploit the potential even in small communities that don't have local resources much more than they would ever be able to do otherwise. Acquiring statistics on what sites are in a particular location so that you can design plans for management. Monitoring changes, of course, inevitably requires local involvement. You know, you can investigate the changes in policy. So if a management plan is implemented, how can you investigate whether it's having the desired impact? And this is, again, where I think involvement of the community is so valuable. You know, of course, the old expression, many hands make light work. I am finding that many eyes make light work. For instance, yesterday, someone contacted me and said that a church that we had mapped a few years ago had been demolished that day, so that it's no longer present. So we, of course, can update our database. Or the reverse can happen when a building that has been sitting empty is renovated. You know, these sorts of local pieces of information can be captured fairly easily, far more easily perhaps than if it's trying to be done by one level of government. You can identify problems, you can identify opportunities for maintenance, adaptive reuse. Of course, so many times in rural Manitoba, buildings are demolished simply because there's no perceived use for them. And I think that simply means that a lack of foresight, a lack of knowledge, a lack of experience. And so that when you engage a larger group, I think you can potentially use things that are otherwise not used. And then finally, I think to gauge community priorities. Because, for example, abandonment of a structure is ultimately a statement of priorities. So maintaining information about those priorities then, of course, gives us a better basis for managing them. And then, of course, ultimately, it seems to me, is planning. To take this information, to bring to the attention of a larger audience, hopefully to generate the kind of engagement that is required to maintain the inventory, but also to engage the public. My new book, for example, I have had all kinds of wonderful feedback. People who were so excited to learn about things that they never knew about. This provides a valuable means to engage people at a more fundamental level than I have ever found before. And it's not restricted to the people who feel comfortable with the technology. Frankly, I find that even elderly people who will never have a smartphone, who have no idea how to use a GPS receiver, who will not use an online database, by taking the information that we collect in this project and putting in the form of books like the one I've just published, engages them as well. And in fact, some of my best information, my best clues on additional places to map come from those sorts of things. So simply providing a deeper experience for people to reach new audiences, to encourage public dialogue on priorities, all of these things I think are a useful thing going forward. Well, now in terms of going forward then, as I wrap this up, it occurs to me that there are lots of things that we still have to do. So for example, we are continuing to map new, and I say new reservedly, of course, because many of these sites, most of these sites are not new, but mapping them so that they bring them to the attention of a larger group. Maintaining and updating the information. I am often inundated with updates to the degree that sometimes I get a little behind. I have a folder, for instance, and where I maintain some of these updates that are needing to be done. And it sometimes numbers in the dozens to the hundreds. So when I sometimes have a break, I can keep them updated. I am also engaging, of course, other people to help in this process. But it really strikes me as essential that we maintain a public dialogue so that we can keep this information up to date, so that we don't say, go and check out this school, but the school was demolished 5 years ago. We don't want that to happen. We are improving the interface. As I mentioned, we do have a version that runs on a smartphone, but not especially well. The next version that is hopefully going to be done soon will improve the ability to search on a mobile interface, so that you could use it on a smartphone. This phone essentially would tell you what is in the vicinity of your location, so that you could be walking down a street in your city, you can be driving on a country road, and your phone essentially becomes your tour guide. But I think where the best opportunities lie in making this database useful is to expand the metadata. I'll be quite frank, that oftentimes sites in it are hard to find, mainly because I don't know, I cannot anticipate the various ways in which it might be searched. And I'm always encouraging people who draw attention to sites and say, you should probably say that this site was a very important one to people of Polish ethnicity. Well, I can add that as a keyword to the database and then it will show up. But I can't anticipate all of those keywords. I can do them as I encounter them, but it does require involvement from the public. So ultimately, I am utterly dependent on the community to identify and to assist in this process. And that's why I regularly share my contact information. I would share it with all of you. If you at all have feedback for me now or into the future, I would encourage you to contact me. I'd be happy to share whenever I can, to give you advice if you want it, to respond to criticisms if you have it. Of course, I readily admit that I'm not altogether knowledgeable, but also aspects of this. So if you have advice to offer, I would be pleased to receive it. And I thank you for your attention to this webinar.
So thank you again, Dr. Gordon, for sharing this information with us. It was very informative. For those in the audience, if you have any questions, just again, a little friendly reminder, the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, I would just ask that you put your questions in there so that way they can get asked. During the presentation, we did have one question come up. It was The question is from Darren, and his question is, have you considered the various locations in Riding Mountain National Park, such as the POW camp, the Kippens Mill, and the 1944 airplane crash?
Yes, I have actually. The POW camp, for instance, is one of my objects I want to get to. I've been told about it. I have personally not been there. There's also, in addition to the prisoner of war camp, there is a conscientious objector camp in the park as well. I'd like to go to see it. There's also several fire towers where people used to stay to detect forest fires. And that's also a site. So yes, absolutely. I am definitely interested in mapping sites in the national park. I am, of course, also eager to receive information. So if, for example, people have information to share, I would happily, I personally don't have to visit every one of these sites. If people have information that they're willing to share, I'm happy to receive it.
I just had a small quick question for you, Dr. Gordon. The new book that you recently released, was there any inspiration behind it, or or any inspiration that why you wrote that book?
Well, the main inspiration, I suppose, is to share some of the information that I've come across in the course of doing the research on the various sites that we have mapped. And a lot of times there's an important story to be told. You know, so for example, just down the river, the Assiniboine River from Brandon, there is in the center of the river a large concrete pillar. People have asked me, what exactly was that? It's not in use, apparently. It's all battered and scarred, and people don't know what it might have been. Well, it turns out it was a railway bridge that was built back in about 100 years ago. The plan was to provide a railway line from Brandon to a little place called Brookdale, northeast of Brandon. Well, it turned out they had overbuilt the capacity for railways, and therefore they didn't really need that bridge. They didn't really need the railway line, and so the bridge was actually abandoned before it was even completed. So the story that it tells is of railway abandonment. The railway abandonment across the province has been rampant. So many lines that were once the lifeblood of communities in rural Manitoba, the way that you would reach communities was by rail. The fact that you can no longer go by rail, in fact, now you can't even go by bus because the bus lines have been stopped as well. You know, it changes the whole complexion of rural life in these communities. So it seems to me that the story behind that little concrete pillar in the river is the story of the evolution of rural Manitoba, especially rural depopulation. So there's the backstory, it seems to me. So my inspiration in writing the book was to take a site and show how it reveals something about the change in Manitoba through the years.
Okay, we have one from Brad. He said, have you looked at LiDAR yet?
Yes, indeed. I actually attended a presentation a few weeks ago where an expert from Minnesota was talking about the opportunities in LiDAR data, that you could see remarkable levels of detail on the ground. You know, he showed an image, for example, of an airport that you could see the aircraft sitting on the runways at the airport. You know, so yes, absolutely. A lot of these sites, for instance, where there were buildings, you can see foundations that are still present. You can locate buildings that are long gone. The building at least is gone. The foundation is still present. And I envision that that would be a very useful thing that you could use LiDAR for. The drawback, unfortunately, is that LiDAR data in Manitoba is still in its infancy. We do have data for certain parts of the province, particularly places that are prone to flooding, but we don't have a good database for the entire province. And that's gradually being acquired. I mean, there are increasing efforts by the government, by nonprofit organizations to acquire LiDAR data. And so I do envision that that's going to be a very useful thing in the future. Just as ortho photos have been a useful source of information as well, that they go back to the 1990s, and you can see, for example, evolution in certain parts of the province. You can compare those images in the ortho photos, which are, of course, high resolution, often are they're geo-referenced, so you can get the latitude and longitude right from them. That's also been a very useful source of information, are these ortho photos. But as you're right, exactly, LiDAR is going to be another very useful tool once it's more widely available for much of at least the province here in Manitoba, and of course other places where this approach might be used.
Brad is just saying that the local conservation districts have it now for us.
Yes, absolutely, that's right. The conservation districts are one of the leaders in collecting this information because of its usefulness in doing things like flood forecasting and flood preparation. And I think that is a very useful thing. Unfortunately, it's still not readily available for the entirety of Manitoba, and of course other places as well. But I agree absolutely. The conservation districts are a good source of information for this and other sorts of land use information. I've often thought too that we could work with more closely with the conservation districts for the mapping of the historic resources, because of course there they engage local knowledge, and that's often invaluable as a way of finding out what is out there on the landscape. You know, I will often find out about things from simply talking to, for instance, a farmer in the local area. He'll say, do you know about this or that? And of course, as an outsider, I would never know about these things if were it not for that local advice. So absolutely, the conservation districts, because they're a local initiative, would be an exceptionally valuable resource as well. Perhaps I can remind people of my email address so that if they wish to contact me, they're more than happy to do so. My email address is Gordon, Gordon, at MHS, which stands for Manitoba Historical Society, .mb.ca. Gordon at mhs.mb.ca. I'm pleased to have emails. I'll be happy to respond and offer advice, but I'll be glad to have advice as well.
Okay, so on that note, I believe these are all our questions. Dr. Gordon, do you have anything to add?
I think that's it for me. Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to speak this today.
Okay, you're welcome. I would like to thank you, Dr. Gordon, once again for your great presentation, and as well as the audience for attending and for your participation. Have a great rest of the day to everybody, and thank you for participating.
Thank you all.